Competition. I am in competition right now. I'm currently in competition for space on the floor with a cat who is also competing with me for attention with this screen. But that's not the competition we're going to talk about today, cute though she may be. We're going to need to define competition, niche, realized niche, fundamental niche, competitive exclusion, priority effect, and character displacement. These are all really good things to cover, and you're going to see them a lot in ecology. Even though ecology is, moving along pretty well, you're going to see them a bunch in the next couple of weeks. Define and compare types of competition and give examples, always with the examples of competition. So here we are. Let's get some concepts down. Squeaky. So some basic concepts. Fine, I'll bring you in. Hold on. This is a cat, domesticated, Felis sylvestris. So she feeds, mutualism. Do you have mutualism? So she reduces my stress. We could call that mutualism. The presence of cats in a human population may increase the number of humans and will increase the number of cats. So that kind of both of them increasing the numbers of the other is mutualism. Now she would, if she got the chance, she would prey upon the chickadees. So that makes her a fierce predator. I mean, look at the fierce. Commensalism, that's a plus and 0, so she could be a benefit. You're not really a benefit to anything, are you? But she could benefit from the presence of, she could benefit from the presence of a coyote in the population, because a coyote would, she's an indoor cat, a coyote could chase away other cats and therefore leave more birds for her to look at. So that kind of commensalism, weak though it may be. Amensalism is a -0, and there's not really any -0 examples with the cat, and also she's gone. But interspecific competition is where we're going to be today. So on that interspecific interaction scale, she could be competing with a fox for food because they both eat mice, they both eat birds. She could be competing with a kestrel or a falcon for birds because they both eat birds. So in that kind of form, she is an interspecific competitor. An interspecific competition is a minus interaction. So it is population sizes of both competitors will decrease. And that's really what we're looking at, is the population sizes. So here we have S mutans. It's going to be in the presence of, what is this? In the presence of higher or lower soil nitrogen, you can see that there's small, it remains small at very high densities, some type of plant, I'm forgetting exactly what type. And it can be at very low densities, it can grow to a large size. Basically, this is intra-specific competition when you're dealing with self-thinning, really. This plant can not grow very well in the presence of other competitors in its same species. Since high densities can be small plants, low densities can be larger plants. And that's with interspecific competition. One of the consequences can be local extinction of one species, because both populations are going to decrease until one of them decreases far enough that they can't compete anymore. They go out of business. They go extinct, and then the other species can have a better chance. We're actually going to see some good examples of that with paramecia a little bit later on. So the idea, though, of self-thinning is one in here. So this is where we start with far too many individuals, far too many plants in an ecosystem. And my camera is currently at work for Zoom purposes, so I can't take it outside and show you what my yard looks like. I really can't do that with a laptop because it's one of those get close. If you look really closely at my yard, you will see a green mat of weeds, so very small weeds. And that would be a threat to me, and perhaps I should spend weeks and weeks pulling out every single one of those little weeds. But I know that the self-thinning rule exists, What this means is that if I just let them go for a little while, the biomass will end up being tied up in a relatively few individuals. So between these, I probably have 100,000 weeds in my lawn, and they're going to compete with each other such that I have a relatively few individuals that will come into play later on. Or the biomass will be evenly distributed over large numbers of unhealthy individuals. So each of these plants will be relatively small, unhealthy, not enough root size, and they'll die at the first drought. That's an optimistic way to look at it. The pessimistic way to look at it is these self-thinning within species, interspecies interactions, sure, they'll have negative implications on each other's biomass, but they have interspecific competition with my grass. So they'll make the grass go extinct late first and then self-thin, and then I'll have to reseed with grass afterwards. So competition, intraspecific and interspecific, can be happening at the exact same time. And we call this the self-thinning rule. We have this slope of -3/2. It's a general rule, is that the slope of this will be, if it's on the x-axis, is going to be the density on the x-axis, and mean mass on the y-axis is basically going to be a -3/2. So the higher the density, the smaller the mass of surviving individuals. Now, unless they manage to kill each other off, of course. So there is kind of a self-control for the amount of biomass taken in a large number of seedlings. And we actually do see this on campus quite a bit. So there's a path between the Harnett Hall and New Sebula. You'll see this path going from that area to Ernsdorf, and it goes right past Panowitz Foundry, and it goes through a small bit of forest. And in that small bit of forest, you will see thousands of seedlings. These are all geranium seedlings, and they're all yay big. Thousands of them, all sprouting at once. And what's going to happen is the self-thinning rule. Not all of them will reach adulthood. In fact, with such a large density, most of them won't reach adulthood, or if they do, the biomass will be tied up in relatively few, or be distributed over large numbers of not very large plants. And these not very large plants will have lower fitness than if they were growing alone. Also, you will see where there isn't geranium. So you'll see plenty of places where there aren't these really small seedlings everywhere, and that's in the shade of the salal, of the sword ferns, of the bracken ferns, of the ocean spray, and of the small trees. Because these little geraniums, they're annuals, and they only last for 10 months, I think? No, they last 7 or 8 months. They only live for that long. Most of it's winter. So they will be out-competed by these plants that are perennials. So intraspecific and interspecific competition, again, another example with the weeds. Really getting into the weeds of this, aren't I? So there are different types of competition. We're going to define it in different manners. There we go. So we've already gone over the idea of intraspecific versus interspecific. Here you have two blennies, and what you see is each blenny is occupying a small bit of coral and snapping at the nearest blenny to try to keep their own little area secure. That's intraspecific. Now, they probably compete with coral with shrimp or something like that, so that's interspecific competition between species. We also have exploitative or interference competition. So interference competition is to prevent another from using the resource by excluding them using behavior. So that's going to be a direct assault on the other one to keep it from using it. And exploitative competition is to directly use the resource so that another can't use that same limited resource. Essentially, you're better at using it than something else. So these two forms can be either inter or intraspecific. To give an interspecific example, you have two hummingbird species here, the rufous hummingbird and some other species of hummingbird. But what they'll do is if they find a good source of nectar, they'll chase each other away and they'll interfere with the ability of the other hummingbird to gain the resource. Even if there is enough for both, they will fight each other away in an interference competition to prevent another from using the resource. And you really think about it, even if there was enough for both, then only one getting the resource inhibits the fitness of the other, such that when they have offspring, there will be a higher number of the species that won the little hummingbird battle. Exploitative would be directly using the resource such that another can't use the same limited resource. So let's say you had a watering trough, and at that watering trough, your cattle are drinking. So when they're going to be drinking this from all this water, that's great. They have their resource. And let's say an elephant comes over and starts drinking the resource. Now you know that even though both of them are able to work at the trough together, the elephant is going to drink enough that the cattle no longer have enough, especially if it's a couple of elephants, like it's a couple of cattle. So that's going to be you're directly using the resource, therefore another can't use the same amount. So here's another example of this, and exploitative versus interference competition. Now I'm going to go back to an example with my roommate, because this was, as I was learning this, a direct application at home. So I would make a week's worth of ziti. And that week's worth of ziti was, well, it's all I could eat. That's my dinner, it's right there. My roommate would get just trashed, and he would come home at like 2 a.m. and just hungry drunk, just drunk and hungry. He's going to eat everything. He might vomit it up. He's a terrible person. And he would just pile through that ziti. He'd eat like 3 or 4 days worth of ziti. Now, what is that? That's right. It's exploitative competition. He was a greater eater than me. He had a bigger stomach and could handle more. So he was exploitative competition. Okay. So I said, well, kind of enough is enough. So I started making things that were spicier, because hungry drunk is bad, but hungry drunk eating jalapenos is quickly worse. So I would make chili. And this chili had enough hot peppers in it to incapacitate a small mammal, or a large mammal in this case. And when I made the chili with plenty of hot peppers, he was unable to eat it. So he'd get home, it looks pretty good. Takes a spoonful. This is not a good idea. And then that would be it. What I have done there is what? That's right, interference competition. So interference competition is your ability to just prevent the use of resources by someone else. The worst part was he'd throw me a $5 bill and be like, sorry, I ate your chili, here's $5. It's like, you just added 3 more steps to my chili making process. I have to buy it, cook it, and then store it in the hopes you won't eat it again. So anyway, here's some examples from the oatmeal, a sriracha burn. Essentially, this is someone who wants to keep his date from eating his pad thai. So what does he do? He just with sriracha all over it, and that is interference competition. And here there are people eating chicken wings. If there was a limited number of chicken wings, then that would be exploitative competition, who can exploit the resource the fastest. And Karen's there yelling at a guy to eat faster, you, I don't know, whatever she says. We also have the idea of contest versus scramble. It's less well laid out, so we're not covering it as much as the exploitative versus interference, but a contest being this, it's very similar to an interference competition where organisms are going to fight each other for dominance over a resource, say like lions and hyenas, each trying to maintain their territory in a direct contest. It's not so much interfering with the resource as in fighting each other directly and then getting the resources that come with it. Whereas a scramble is just, well, look, there's a dead elephant on the plain. Y'all get as much meat as you can, as fast as you can. And it's more similar in that case to exploitative competition. All right. So I wanted to review the niche briefly. It's been a little while since we covered niches. Well, I'm assuming you didn't just go back and watch the niche video. But let's just briefly go through the niche, and then we'll get to some effects. The niche is a range of conditions and resources occupied and used by an organism. It might be that these organisms prefer a certain food size, they live at a certain altitude, they live at a certain temperature, there's a certain amount of water they need. So all of this is going to result in this multi-dimensional space filled by an organism. Now, niches are generally specific to species, but sometimes 2 species occupy the same niche. And we're going to see if 2 species are occupying the same niche, that is the essential of competition. is that two species are trying to occupy the same niche and they compete with one another. Now there's a way around this. There's what you have, as I previously defined, is your fundamental niche. What the organism is capable of using. In a perfect world where this organism existed and no other competitors existed, this is the fundamental niche of what it could use. So you see Geospiza fortis, Geospiza filiginosa, and Geospiza magna-rostris. Figure out what order those are in. Magna-rostris, fortis, filiginosa. There we go. So ideally, Geospiza fortis can eat seeds for the depth of 1 millimeter all the way to 6 millimeters. It can. It has a large range of this fundamental niche. But in the presence of these other ones, you're going to have a realized niche. And I know that was already written down there. Just whatever. Anyway, the realized niche is the range of conditions and resources an organism does use when the competitors are present. So Geospiza fortis is best at eating seeds between 2 and 3 millimeters. Geospiza magna-rostris is going to eat anything from 3 to 7 millimeters. So you see where the niches overlap, where Geospiza magna-rostris is better, and therefore Geospiza fortis can only eat seeds of a limited part of its original niche. And that's what it realizes when the competition is present. And Geospiza filiginosa is going to eat seeds that are 1 to 2 millimeters. So really, you're leaving Geospiza fortis with a 2 to 3 millimeter seeds. Not the best of realized niches when it's competing with two other species. It's really not the ideal world, which is really what happens with fundamental niches. Is they're big, or they can be big, but the realized niche can be much smaller. So here's an experiment done with barnacles. What you see is you have adult Thalamus barnacles, and this is one thing we actually tried to do on the 21st of October. We haven't actually reached that yet, so I don't know if that was successful or not. But we had this lab where we looked at Thalamus barnacles and Balanus barnacles, or at least something else. And what we see is Thalamus will live at the upper intertidal zone and is capable of living in the middle intertidal zone in the absence of Balanus barnacles. Now, Balanus barnacles, they can live in the lower intertidal zone, and they are capable of living in the middle intertidal zone. So when they're in the middle intertidal zone, they're actually the superior competitors, and they will exclude Thalamus from that niche. So because the Thalamus niche, including the upper and middle intertidal zone, is now limited by the presence of Balanus to the upper intertidal zone, the Thalamus is in a realized niche. Now, Balanus, being the superior competitor, is capable of actually being in its fundamental niche because the Thalamus is not outcompeting it. It is outcompeting the Balanus is outcompeting Thalamus. Yeah, easy for me to say. So there's also desiccation, though, that's going to prevent Balanus from growing any farther up. So that limits Balanus's niche. And predation would also limit Thalamus's niche in the absence of Balanus. So you see how each has their own niche limited by the presence of other species or other effects. And when two species try to exist together and fail, we call this competitive exclusion. And here are these aforementioned examples of Paramecium. Paramecium aurelia, kept in a separate culture, is going to survive to be about a population of 75, whatever, measured by volume, whatever, 75. And Paramecium caudatum is going to be about a population of 60. But you put them together, what you immediately notice is that it takes Paramecium aurelia a much longer time to get up to that ideal population size of 25. Ideally, K of 75, K equals 75. Aurelia takes a lot longer to get up there in the presence of caudatum. And caudatum never reaches K. In fact, it goes extinct. And that's competitive exclusion. These two species cannot compete with one another, and eternally, one of them will go extinct. And when they go extinct, that allows the superior one to actually take over the niche and reach its carrying capacity. So this was done also with a flower beetle, and this is one of your terms, a priority effect. It's really whatever species gets the higher numbers first is going to win out in the competition. So your T, I can't remember what it's T. It's T. castaneum and T. confusum. They're both types of Tribolium. Tribolium castaneum and Tribolium confusum When grown separately, you see they both reach pretty good effects. When they're grown together, the Tribolium castaneum grows faster and thus excludes the other. So really, it's a race for resources for who can dominate the resources the faster. And really, it's who has a bigger Rmax. Who has a bigger Rmax can dominate the resources first. And now you're starting to see the advantage of ruderals. Ruderals are those plants that I mentioned in a different lecture about how they can grow fast and they can take over an area with the least bit of stress, and you've got stress tolerant, plants, and that's going to be a different matter. But growing fast and taking over ground is the priority effect. And I don't know if you've ever seen how fast Scotch broom can grow, but it's up to 1 meter in a year. Now Douglas fir cannot grow anywhere near 1 meter in a year. So Scotch broom and Douglas fir laid together, put in seeds together, the Scotch broom will outcompete the Douglas fir like that within a year. Boom! Competition is over. And that's competitive exclusion due to priority effect. This is also true, though, of whichever one is already there. So if I were to have a Douglas fir plantation where the Douglas fir is 5 years old, and I introduce Scotch broom to this, the Scotch broom will compete, and will compete hard, and will grow fast, but will lose because the Douglas fir is already having a priority effect. Here's more examples: Paramecium aurelia, Paramecium bursaria, and right underneath me, of course, because I couldn't find a better place to move it, is Paramecium caudatum. Caudatum is reaching about population volume per milliliter. Caudatum's almost 150, so better than bursaria, less than aurelia. What you see here on the bottom is that Paramecium or caudatum loses to aurelia, but wins against bursaria. So you have competitive exclusion between the two species. And also what you see here is, for all of these examples, the final population size after 16 days was less than either would have achieved on their own. So competitive exclusion really is that minus to both species. And here we have examples of exclusion on Daphne major. It's an island in the Galapagos, and we're talking about these finches again. As Geospiza fortis depleted the seed supply, the average hardness of the remaining seeds increased, which caused the average seed hardness declining when new supplies were which meant that Geospiza fortis was able to outcompete certain things like Filiginosa. So during the drought of 1977, there were larger birds capable of cracking harder seeds, and those outcompeted the smaller birds that are not capable of it. So really you have intraspecific competition with Geospiza fortis species that were able to outcompete Geospiza fortis species with smaller beaks, as well as indirectly the birds with beaks that were bigger, Geospiza magnorostris, able to outcompete Geospiza fortis. You see how a niche moving a little bit as the seed hardness increases and the seed abundance goes down causes this competitive exclusion. So it's complicated, and it's way more complicated than that. I'd go to your book. It's a good story, but there's also another book called The Beak of the Finch, which goes in far more detail. If I were to go in more detail, it's just going to sound more confusing. But trust me, it's actually a really cool story. All right, let's move on to resource partitioning. Sometimes there's enough resources for each to live in their realized niche. If the realized niche is still too small to support a population, extinction and competitive exclusion. If the realized niche is large enough to support a viable population, what we get is resource partitioning. So here you have various sizes of seeds. The biggest ones eaten by birds, smaller by mice, smaller by beetle, and smallest by ant. In the absence of birds and mice, the beetles will eat the largest ones and the ants will eat the largest ones. But the resource supply is adequate for each of these populations to exist in a realized niche for a long period of time. And that's called resource partitioning, where the resources are well being partitioned between different species, each of which occupying a realized niche. Now, if anything causes an extinction of one of them, you can see very quickly the niche expands, and suddenly there's occupied niche, which leads to priority effects. So if one goes extinct, if the birds would go extinct, and the mice took over their niche, and the mice expanded, so it's ants, beetles, and mice, and the birds try to get reintroduced, well, the mice now have priority effect. So you can see how these different things will act differently. Depends on who shows up first, how many resources there are. And last, what if They evolve. So let's say there is resource partitioning for a long period of time. Here we have, again, those finches, Geospiza fortis on Daphne Major. And we have Geospiza fuliginosa on Santa Cruz Island. And we have Geospiza fuliginosa on Los Hermanos. So on Los Hermanos, what you see is these beak sizes of Geospiza fuliginosa range from 6 to about 9 millimeters deep. And Geospiza fortis on Daphne Major has beak sizes from about 8 to 12 millimeters deep. Now you see this overlap. And then that overlap implies is that these have an overlapping niche. Well, when they're together on Santa Cruz, what you see there is that beak sizes go away from each other. So you can imagine the seeds here are being eaten where Geospiza fortis will eat the bigger seeds and Geospiza fuliginosa will eat the smaller seeds. When they're present with each other, they're competing for those middle seeds, but since they're not competing for the biggest seeds or the smallest seeds, birds that prefer bigger seeds, i.e. have a bigger beak, are going to have a higher fitness. Birds that avoid competition are going to have a higher fitness. Same is true for smaller seeds with Geospiza fuliginosa. Birds that prefer to avoid competition, that their beak size, I'm not saying they have a choice in the matter, but their beak size enables them to avoid competition, have a higher fitness, thus the evolution of these traits will differ when they're sympatric, living together, more than it would differ in two allopatric populations living apart. What I'm saying is when they're together, they look more different. When they're apart, they look more similar. For other examples of this, we have weasels, Mustela erminus and Mustela invalis. When they are sympatric, you see that Mustela erminus is going to have 50.4 millimeter long skulls, and Mustela invalis is going to have a 39 millimeter skull. When they're together, when they're apart, you see how these skulls are actually closer together. So you see the ratio is different in sympatric and allopatric populations. You have the two mice species. They have a sympatric ratio of 1.09 and an allopatric ratio of 1.04. Okay, that's not too impressive. But look at those nuthatches, the beak size. The ratio when they're sympatric is 1.23, where the larger one is much larger and the smaller one is much smaller. And when they are allopatric, it's actually the sizes are actually reversed, and the ratio is very similar. And Galapagos finches, we've covered those enough, don't you think? Yeah, so basically, when you think of this with coyotes and wolves, too. So coyotes are larger when wolves are absent. So coyotes can take down fawns. But when wolves are present, coyotes will get smaller because that's why the coyotes are taking down things like rabbits and mice, and the wolves are taking down things like fawns and full deer. So their niche changes as they evolve away from competition. That's the essence of character displacement. Now, there can also be the exploitation of new niches. Sometimes an organism has adaptations that allow it to exploit a new niche, and that's what's true here with Gallium species. That Gallium saxatiles is largely confined to acidic soils and Gallium sylvestre to basic soils. The seeds of both species will germinate on both soils, but it turns out that Gallium punilium is a better competitor on the basic soil, so it tends to outcompete and tends to be more present there. So that meant when there was, that's why I was saying new niches, well, when more basic soils were brought up from underground, so during mining times, Gallium sylvestre, which has been obviously renamed Gallium punilium, seemed like a necessary step for this figure. Sorry for the sarcasm there. Anyway, Gallium sylvestre was more common on the basic soils in mine tailings. So you have this new niche, mine tailings, and it was rapidly exploited by Gallium sylvestre, but not Gallium saxatiles. So this is where a new niche can arise, and the species that is a better competitor on that can exploit it fully. Now, I said a new niche can arise, and a species that is a better competitor can exploit it fully. What if an old niche exists, but the species that is a better competitor is an invader? So an invading snail can grow at a faster rate in both low and medium snail densities. What you have there is an invading snail able to outgrow and have a priority effect over a native snail. Organisms that can quickly exploit niches can become invasive. Organisms with a priority effect that grow faster, that invest more into growth and reproduction, are going to have a priority effect and thus are going to competitively exclude native species. Phragmites australis is this type of reed, and the native ones do not grow that fast, but the introduced ones spend a lot of their energy into growth and reproduction, thus they outcompete the native species. So we see here how invasive species compete with native species, and if that invasive species is going to be more competitive, is going to be a faster grower or a more prolific reproducer, then it's going to have that resource partitioning, and it's going to have that competitive exclusion effect through the priority effect. Well, what if the invasive species is not as good of a competitor as the native? Well, it's not going to become invasive then. So we have another lecture on invasive species and what happens when these organisms exploit new niches and come over to new areas. And what happens evolutionarily is, well, I find it fascinating.